All right, hey there. Good morning. Welcome to the online gathering of the Pathways Church community. My name is Nick, and it's been a fantastic week around the Pacific Northwest. I mean, beautiful summer temperatures, not too hot, not too cold, perfect sunshine. It's just been awesome. So hopefully you've had a chance to experience a little of that, be outside and enjoy it. I mean, this is why we live here for these moments, right? We deal with so much rain during the year. It's kind of nice to see the blue sky. And interestingly enough, we're going to be talking a little bit about the weather, the rain today. But before we get to all of that, I just want to introduce you to this group that you stumbled upon. We are the Pathways Church community, and I kind of give a little spiel about us every week on this video here because I know we want this to be accessible. There's people that stumble onto this who have not met this group before, and so we want to just introduce ourselves a little bit. If you want to get to know a little bit more about us, you can go to our website at findpathways.com. You can read up on us a little bit there. But we've listed in the corner of the screen here our core values. And the way we see ourselves is we are kind of spiritual travelers together. We're on a journey together. We are pursuing what it means to live like Jesus, to allow Him to live through us. But it's a journey, and some of us have been on this walk for a little longer than others. Some of us are rather new to this walk. But either way, none of us has all the answers. We are on a journey together. And in some ways, the journey is as important as the destination. And we've discovered that we're not just trying to get to an end point, that there are things that God is trying to do in us in this moment along the journey, whether things are going good or not so good. And there are some things we want to just slow down and notice their value along this journey. And so we've got those things listed in the corner of the screen there. Now, if you want to read up a little bit more about what we mean by those things, you can do that on our website, and we'd be happy to have you check that out so you can learn a little bit more about us. Now, people often say, give me your elevator pitch, what is this church all about? And so we often give them two words, okay? We are cautious. We are a group of people who, many of us have grown up in religious environments because in the United States, you're probably going to be exposed to some religious traditions. But many of us have seen religion used in some really beneficial ways, Christianity used in some really helpful, beneficial ways. But we've also seen religion used in ways that can be rather toxic and harmful and exclusive. We've seen even religion with Jesus' name on it get in bed with all sorts of things like greed and politics. And so we find ourselves being a little cautious, a little skeptical of organized religion, which, I get it, is a bit of an oxymoron. We are an organized group of people who are a little skeptical about organized religion. And that's just the facts. That's the tension that we live in. So we find ourselves being a little cautious about religion. But, however, we are a very curious bunch. We like to ask a lot of questions. We are people who are trying to discover what it means to live like Jesus. We feel compelled by Him, and we have a lot of questions. And some of those questions revolve around things that we learned growing up, things that were handed down to us, beliefs, practices, all sorts of things that we would like to ask some questions about. And sometimes we question these things and we end up right where we started, but other times we question things and discover, maybe that's not the best way of thinking about things. And we can see here that questioning, curiosity, those are actually very beneficial things to faith. That's what a vibrant faith does, is it questions things, because then you begin to own some of these convictions and beliefs that you have. So we think this is a really good group to ask a lot of questions. Now, we're a group that's cautious. We are a group that is curious. And if either of those two things kind of resonates with you, then this might be a fun faith community to explore. In fact, a lot of our sermon series, we practice both of these things, being cautious about what it is we think we know and curious about the things that we don't know. And hopefully today we're going to see that played out. Now, what we're going to be doing here over the next couple moments in this online thing is Billy, our worship leader, is going to come on screen. He's going to lead a couple songs, just two. And sandwiched in between these two songs is a reflective video, and it's just a chance for you to personally meditate and worship if you would like to do that. And then after that is over, I'm going to come back on screen, and we're doing a series right now called Construction Zone, and we are looking at violence in the Bible and how do we reconcile that with the peace-loving, love your enemies Jesus of the New Testament. And we're near the very end of this series, but today is a good one. It's one where you can't talk about violence in the Bible without talking about this particular story. So I'll share a little message on that. We'll learn together a little bit, hopefully, and then we'll wrap up with some communion time. Billy will come back on screen. He'll play a song, and that's a chance for us to take communion together in this online space if you'd like to do that. In our in-person gatherings, we bring out the bread and the cup, but in the online space, you'll have to do that on your own. So this would be a good time to go find those elements if you'd like to participate. You can go to your kitchen. You can get a little piece of bread or a cracker even. And for the cup, if you want to just get some juice, maybe get some juice in the fridge or some wine left over from last night, that would work. Bring those two things out and we'll celebrate the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus in the end together in communion. And then at the end of that, I'm just going to wrap us all up with some announcements, and there's a lot of stuff going on this summer that we want to let you know about, okay? So that's pretty much it for today. Why don't we get right into this thing? We'll let Billy lead us in a time of worship, and I'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Okay, let's do it.
Song of all songs is the song we sing. Song of our sounds having symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heavens, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Song of all songs is the song we sing. Sound of all sounds having symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heavens, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. Your presence is an open door. We want you, Lord, like never before. Your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. In every season, your grace has been enough, and I'm believing the best is yet to come. The cross before me, my hope on things above, and in you, Jesus, the best is yet to come. Your presence is an open door. We want you, Lord, like never before. Your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. Your presence is an open door. Want you, Lord, like never before. Your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. Your presence is an open door. We want you, Lord, like never before. Hey, your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. So come now, Lord, like never before.
Throughout history, the Almighty has appeared unto a very few. Moses, Abraham, Joan of Arc, Bruce. Next summer, he will choose a new prophet to bring his message to the world.
Every
But God only knows why he chose Evan.
Let it out, son. It's the beginning of wisdom.
Who are you?
I'm God.
Yeah.
And I want you, Evan Baxter, to build an ark.
Building an ark is really not part of my plans here. No! No! Big one! I need to make a good impression at work. Gentlemen, good to see you.
Evan, you look like a bum in a suit.
Oh.
Are you starting a Bee Gees tribute band?
Ah, you gotta go shave. I can't shave. Whenever I shave, the beard grows right back in. That's what happens when you shave. But then you shave again.
Don't worry, help is on the way. And if anybody asks, tell them flood's coming.
You want to build a boat?
It might be something fun for the family. Go! Go sailing on the lake? I don't know. Be great in case it floods or something.
Evan Almighty.
Oh, that is a great movie, isn't it? Evan Almighty. I know that it came out in 2007 or whatever that says. So it's not exactly a new release. And spoiler alert, they're all saved in a giant ark, which you might expect. But it's a great movie, isn't it? It's one of my kids' favorite movie. It was a sequel to Bruce Almighty, which was another funny movie. But my kids didn't really like Bruce Almighty so much, but they loved Evan Almighty. And it is the story of Noah and the flood, right? Retold, because this story is got such staying power that even Hollywood in recent times is remaking this story, the story of Noah and the flood, in this case with a little bit of a modern twist. Are you familiar with this story? The story of Noah and the flood? I mean, most people are. Even if you aren't like a church person or haven't read your Bible like a ton, you probably know this story. It just sort of floats around in our ethos and our culture, and everybody's sort of aware of the gist, anyway, of the Noah story. I mean, it's a story that, I don't know, it's just so cute, isn't it? I mean, you got all the animals, you got like a zoo, basically, and that's kind of why we end up using this story as stuff as like a kid's story, right? When your kid is born, oftentimes in the nursery, Noah's Ark is still one of the most popular themes for children's nurseries, and, you know, it just has this, like, lovable place in our heart. And when you think about it, though, as popular as this story is, as it's billed kind of as a children's story, when you really start to think about the story of Noah and the ark, it's not really a kid's story. And that's what we want to rethink today. Because we may have grown up in Sunday school hearing this story or watching Veggie Tales about it or whatever else, and it seems like a nice, affable, loving story. But it's actually a pretty adult, grown-up story. It's the story, despite what this picture over my shoulder shows, it is a story of the death of almost every living thing on earth at God's hand. And really, this story takes place only 6 chapters into the Bible. So 6 chapters into the Bible, it's as if God is out of ideas and just says, screw it, I'm gonna kill everything and start over. Now, it's sort of hard to imagine that God gives up 6 chapters in, but it's also hard to picture Jesus coming up with such a solution, right? You know what? I don't know what to do. These people are out of control. Let's just kill everybody on the planet, or mostly everyone, and just start over. There is a serious disconnect there between this story of the flood and the Jesus that we meet in the New Testament, which brings us to the title screen here of our series, Construction Zone. We are in season 2 of this series called Construction Zone, where we are discussing violence. Namely, how do we reconcile the violence that we find mostly in the Old Testament with the nonviolent, peaceful, love your enemies way of Jesus in the New Testament. Now, we've gone through a lot in this series, and if you've missed some of it, I'd say go back here in the YouTube files and check out some of it. I think there's some helpful stuff in there if this is a problem that you've wrestled with. But the problem here is not just that the people of Israel, God's people, engage in violence that they say is condoned by God, sometimes even commanded by God. But the bigger problem is that God is depicted in acting in judgment using violence like this story of the flood. And so today what we want to do is take a closer look at this Genesis flood story. Because how could God love people, love humans, and also decide to wipe them all away in a flood? Okay, so we want to look at this story. We're going to take a closer look at it here today. And the first thing, as we kind of zoom in on this, okay, let's just pretend we're not in Sunday school anymore. We're going to approach this text, this story, as adults, okay, the way that we normally approach a text. So what we need to do is deconstruct this way of thinking about this warm, happy story here that we learned as a kid, and we need to approach it as adults here today. And I think the first thing that we're going to see is that this is a story that contains the largest act of violence in the entire Bible, okay? I mean, you can't do a series on violence in the Bible and not deal with the flood story. I mean, more people, at least on a percentage, are wiped out in this story, supposedly, than any other story in the Bible. I mean, this is the biggest atrocity of human death, animal death, plant death, I suppose, in the entire Bible. Now, perhaps as we rethink this, we need to do a quick little recap here, because you remember the story is told in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, and we don't really, frankly, have time to read 3 chapters of the text here today. But you can go back and read that if you want to. Let me just give you the synopsis, okay? There's a guy named Noah and his family, and God looks down on the earth, and he sees a problem. People are screwed up, all right? They're violent, they're killing one another, they're greedy, there's all sorts of evil unleashed in the world. And so God decides on a path, Genesis 6 verse 7. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. And then we jump down to verse 11. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Okay, now what follows here is the story with the largest act of violence in the Bible. And you painted it on your nursery wall. Congratulations, that's a very disturbing thing to do, right? Nearly all of humankind is going to be destroyed in this story at God's hand. And almost all the animals too. It's not just the people. God looks down and he's going to wipe out all the people, but he's also going to kill most of the animals as well. And strangely, it even says he's going to destroy all of the earth or the land. God is going to wipe them all out except for one family and one small floating zoo of animals. Now, what God does here is he tells Noah to build an ark, which is a Hebrew word that literally means a chest or like a box. And he tells Noah and his family to put the animals inside of this box, okay, this ark. 2 of each animal, one male and one female, although there's another rendition of the story here where it's 7 of the clean animals and 2 of each of the unclean, but we'll get to that in a minute. There's some differences in the story, okay? They go inside this box, this ark though, and it starts to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Remember that? And it finally stops. The floodwaters are everywhere, but then the floodwaters start to recede. And so as the floodwaters start to recede, Noah's able to see the tops of mountains, like, hey, we got some dry land out there. And so he sends out birds to look for dry land that they can get on. And eventually a dove comes back with an olive branch in its beak. And so Noah believes that there is now dry land available. And so Noah and his family and all the animals, they come out of the ark, they worship God, and God puts a big rainbow in the sky, you remember that? Saying that he will never flood the earth again. All right, that's a recap of the story here. And there are some animals involved, and there is a zoo that's floating around, but it is a pretty disturbing story with an epic amount of violence in it. God is displeased with humanity, it appears, and this is a story of judgment. And we all like zoos, but it's pretty hard not to read this story as a kid or even as an adult and not be a little curious about the type of God who would order such a thing, a little fearful of God. I remember reading this story as a kid and being a little anxious or fearful of God because God might be right when he looks down and sees that humans are violent, But as he calls out the violence of human, his response then is just to escalate that violence, to just wipe everybody out. I mean, we're talking about as violent as humans may have been, what God does here is violence on a whole other scale. I mean, this is violence on a global scale. Talk about using weapons of mass destruction, right? I mean, this is the ultimate mass destruction. I mean, this is violence that is more extreme than Hitler. This is beyond genocide. This is humanicide? Is that a word? I mean, it's wiping out of nearly all people. And then the animals too? I mean, the animals have to be saying, well, what the heck did we do? I mean, we weren't the ones doing all these evil things. Why are you killing us? All right. So the first thing that we want to notice here is that this is the largest act of violence in the Bible. And I just want to point that out because it's important for us to see that this isn't a cuddly little story, all right? This is something that we have to deal with. It's not people engaging in violence, but it goes right to the nature of God in that would God do something this violent? And if God would wipe out all of humanity, just 6 chapters into the Bible, how do we match that up with Jesus' call to love our enemies, and what's more, his willingness to go and die on our behalf to rescue us, rather than wiping everyone out? All right, well, the next thing I want to point out here as we take a closer look at this story, and this might be something now as we try to unpack some of this that'll begin to help us understand what it is that we're dealing with here. And as we begin to understand what we're dealing with, perhaps it'll help us along the way to understanding what to do with a story like this. And the second thing we want to notice here in our closer look is that this is not the first and not the only flood story that's out there in the ancient world. This is not by far the only flood story in the ancient world in Mesopotamia. There are all sorts of Sumerian and Babylonian stories that are very similar, with some important differences as well. But most, if not all, of these stories are actually even written before the book of Genesis. Okay, there's some very popular ones that people know of, right? The biggest one probably being the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic contains a flood story that is very similar to Genesis, and it is likely written 1,000 years before the Bible story. Now, I was a student minister for a long time, and I remember one of my high school students came home from college, and I'd done 1 year, in a university somewhere, and I think he'd taken like a comparatives religion class or something like that. And he came home after his first semester and saw him out, and he just said, "Did you know that the Bible is plagiarized?" And I said, I don't know. What do you mean by that? And he said, the Bible, it's plagiarized. The Bible writers took stories from other religious groups and they just copied them. I mean, the whole flood story, he said, it's just copied from Sumerian and Babylonian myths. And how could this possibly be God's word if it's just plagiarized material? Now, his concern was actually a good one, because he is right that the Bible flood story is not the only flood story, and it's not by far the first. But the question is it just plagiarized? I mean, did the Israelites just plagiarize or copy the Gilgamesh epic? Well, not exactly. There's some for all the similarities, there are some significant differences, which we don't have time to get into today. But there are several major flood stories and some minor ones that were floating around the ancient world before the Genesis material was probably put together. And the people in this area used these stories as the basis for their theology. And maybe it appears that perhaps these flood stories were based on some sort of actual flood that happened in that region in ancient history. There's one around 3000 BCE and another one around 10,000 that geologists believe happened in that region. And so perhaps these stories grew out of different people groups trying to explain why that had occurred. But what happens here is it appears that Israel takes this story of a flood, and that many people have told the story about, that is just kind of an ancient trope story, and they restylize it to explain their God, Yahweh. Now, it's important to understand that everyone did this. this wasn't really plagiarism. It wasn't like using ChatGPT on your homework. It was just using the language of the day that everyone understood to explain your God, right? I mean, today we use science to explain a lot of things, and when we want to talk about God, we may explain the phenomenon of what God has created or done in this world using science, right? But in their day, instead of science, they had these epic stories. And so they're not plagiarizing this content so much as they're just purposing it the way that anyone else does to explain their God. They're not doing history or journalism so much as they're doing theology. Which means this is an ancient trope story that many people have used to explain and describe their God. And there's a caution here in using it too literally. If it's an old trope story, it's rhetoric. It's theology, not straight history. Now, the next thing we need to notice as we take a closer look at this story is that it is written from a limited ancient perspective. Now, there are some practical problems with this story that we are going to get into in a moment, okay? Just as we kind of think through, like, could a flood like this have happened and how would that work? Okay, there's some practical problems there we'll get into in a minute. But first, let's examine the actual picture that Genesis is giving us about this flood story. Not just that it rained a lot. I mean, those of us who live in Seattle this week, past week aside, we know what it's like to have a lot of rain. But this is going a bit beyond this. This story is relying on a view of how the world works that is pre-scientific, that we today know is just factually inaccurate. Now, to get a sense of this, let's take another little look at another couple verses here, this time out of Genesis 7, verses 11 through 12. It tells us in the 600th year of Noah's life, wow, that's old, on the day that all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. You say, wow, raining for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, that's a lot of rain. If it just rained continually for 40 days, that would be a lot of rain. But you know what? Frankly, I live in the Seattle area, and it feels like most winters there's a stretch where it's been raining for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, it's a lot of rain. It just drives me crazy. But apparently what's being described here is even worse, because I've never seen the entire globe flooded due to the rain that I'm experiencing in the Seattle area. But there's a lot more going on here than just the description of a particularly rainy season. There's a picture in this text using some key words here that we'll see, that is a picture of how these ancient Israelites believe that the world actually works. Now, to understand this, we need to understand a little bit about ancient cosmology. And we've talked about this before. Basically, what we need to know for these purposes is that ancient people don't understand how water recycling works like we do, right? We know today that water is within a closed system here called Earth, and we know that water is constantly recycling, right? Water evaporates, and then it becomes clouds in the sky. It rains back down onto the Earth, where it pools up into oceans, rivers, lakes, streams, whatever, and then it evaporates again into the clouds and then rains down, right? We know how water recycling works because of science. But that is not at all how the ancient people thought about how rain worked. In ancient cosmology, they had a picture like this one over my shoulder here. And as we've talked about this before too, ancients believed that the world basically existed in three parts. There was the sky, which was blue. There was the oceans and the water, which they could see was blue. And then there was the land parts where air breathers could live in between, right? And when the ancients looked up in the sky and they saw it was blue, they thought, that looks like water. It's blue up there. And so that must be an ocean above us. But what could keep all that ocean water from crashing in on us? Well, it must be something in the way blocking it, which they called the firmament, right? And it was clear, obviously, because you could see the water, but it was solid and it was not allowing the water, the ocean above you, to come down and drown you. But what they believed were there were these little places like windows that could open up and let some of that water through. And when it did, that's what created rain. And what did they call these little windows? They called them, as verse 11 mentions here, the floodgates of the heavens. Now, when we say, wow, it's raining hard today, somebody opened the floodgates, we mean that metaphorically. They meant it literally. Someone has opened up, the gods have opened up these floodgates, these little windows in that clear barrier that's holding back that ocean up there, and they're letting some of the water through. And so what they believed in this story here is that the water came up from underneath, but also that that big ocean in the sky came crashing down on them. Now, to accept this story as literal, historic, we would have to accept their view of cosmology, because it's stated right there in the text. It was the floodgates that opened. So if we're going to take this and read this literally, we're going to have to accept their view of cosmology. And of course, nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believes that there are floodgates in the clear barrier holding back the ocean in the sky. So everybody reading this story is taking some liberty with it to read it metaphorically and not literally. Everybody is taking it some liberty with it to some degree or another, and nobody can possibly read this story in a modern world literally. And if you do try to read it literally or historically, you end up with a few other problems. Because, literally speaking, the story of the flood has some very practical problems. Now, we've already read about the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but here is the result that Genesis 7 tells us. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. That's the land. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Wow! So, the text is telling us here that it rained so hard that the entire earth is covered with water, and the ark floats above it. Now, if we leave our Sunday school class here as kids for a moment and think about this just for a minute as adults, we recognize that there are some significant problems to what we're reading here. First of all, the ancient people did not know that the earth was a globe. They didn't know it was round. They didn't know it was a sphere. Now we do, but they didn't. When I say we do, I know there's some people today that are flat earthers who don't believe that the earth is a globe. But most of us understand that the earth is round. And so when the ancient people say the whole earth, they have no concept in their mind of the earth being a globe. They're just talking about everything that they can see. In fact, the word earth here, it can just as easily be translated, and often is, land. Not in the idea of the entire world, but just of the land, the earth, the dirt, right? Now, another problem with this, besides the fact that the ancient people had no concept of a globe, is that we're talking about depths of water here that seem, well, maybe impractical. Water covering the highest mountains, the text says. Now, think of this. Can you imagine the Himalayan mountains or Mount Everest? I mean, if it rained nonstop for 40 days and 40 nights, would that be enough water to cover the top of Mount Everest? And where would it run off to? If the water covered up the highest peaks, when the waters receded, where did it go? I mean, where would all of that water find a home, a place to recede to? Now, this is why many people say this is something that is very true with a lot of these ancient stories, is that they used hyperbole like this in order to create a point. Another problem is the mingling of fresh water and salt water. I mean, if water covered the whole globe, we wouldn't have fresh water and salt water. Everything would become salt water, which would kill all the stuff that requires fresh water. And it appears that Noah and his family come off the boat and are still able to drink, presumably because they go on living, some sort of fresh water. Another problem in this story is it would kill not just all the humans and all the animals, but it would also kill all the plant life if it was submerged underwater for at least 40 days. And so what is it that Noah and his family are going to eat when they get off the boat? Can't eat the animals, you need them to repopulate, and there's no plant life either. And another problem is we have a dove finding an olive branch right as the waters are starting to recede. And how would this be possible if everything is wiped out? Another problem with this story is obviously the improbability or the impossibility of being able to gather all species of animals across the world. I mean, Noah here is in Mesopotamia. How did he get animals that were specific to North America? How did he get those on the boat? And as long as we're talking about this boat, as large as the ark is, how could you possibly have a vessel big enough to hold all of the animals of the world? And what's more, if you did, how could you possibly feed them? And then, of course, another problem with this story is there's no geological record whatsoever of a worldwide flood. Now, if we're going to read, that's just a few of the problems in this story. If you want to read it literally. And look, I believe in miracles. I think God can do anything he wants to do. If God wants to make a worldwide flood, I'm sure he could. I'm not opposed to that idea, but it doesn't seem to be what's happening here. I know from our modern mindset, we'd love for this story to be journalism, but its overlap with other ancient stories makes this riff on the story seem much more theological than journalistic. Now, reading it literally may have some problems, but reading it theologically makes a lot of sense because there are some very important parallels in this story to other stories that are teaching theological ideas. Now, the ancient Hebrews, they weren't really worried about recording history as a journalist like we are today. They were much more interested in teaching theology through story, talking about their deity and their identity as a people through these epic stories. Now, this might bother us today, right? Because we don't understand how people could not employ solid fact-finding journalism to their histories, right? That's what we want. That's a very Western, modern mindset that we have. But just because that bothers you does not mean it bothered the ancient Israelites, because they aren't setting out to tell a newspaper account of what happened with the flood. They're setting out to talk about their God and their identity as his people. And they're using a common story of their day that was floating around the ethos there to illustrate their identity and to talk about their God. Now, to understand this, we need to see the parallels of the story of the flood with Genesis 1 and 2, the two stories of creation. Because the Noah story seems intentionally told to parallel the creation accounts that we read in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, we remember Genesis 1 and 2 talk about creation, not necessarily creation out of nothing, but really taking something that is formless and void and adding order to it, right? Remember, for the ancient world, for the ancient people, the strongest thing that gods could do was not to create something. They all assumed the gods created everything. The thing that would ascribe to them the most power was being able to take things that were in chaos or formless and void and bring order and purpose to them. And that is what we see happening in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, we see the same thing about to happen here in the flood story. Now, in Genesis 1 and 2, there are two creation scenes, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And in other series, we've discussed how those are two separate stories. They don't have the same details. In fact, they have some contradicting details. And it appears that the editors put these two stories that they knew were not the same side by side to preserve both traditions there. Now, when we read the flood story in Genesis 6 through 9, there appear again to be two different versions of the flood story. Now, in Genesis, it's very opaque and obvious. One story in chapter 1, one story in chapter 2. In Genesis 6 through 9, with the flood stories, these two stories appear to be interwoven a little tighter. But it appears that they're done so to mimic what is happening in Genesis 1 and 2. For instance, one of the differences that I already pointed out in Genesis 6 through 9 is that in one part of the story, it tells us that Noah is instructed to gather a pair of animals, right? 2 of each kind, a male and a female, and bring them into the ark. But later on it says you're to bring 7 of the clean animals and just a pair of the unclean animals. And you think, well, which is it? Is it a pair or is it 7? Which is it? Well, it appears to be 2 different tellings of the story that have been intermingled into one. Now, another similarity between these 2 stories is the family structure. In Genesis 1 and 2, we meet a family, remember, Adam and Eve, and it goes on to describe Adam and Eve and their 3 sons, a family of 5. And here in Genesis 6 through 9 with Noah, we meet Noah and his wife and their 3 sons, again, a family of 5. We have 2 things dealing with water. In the creation narratives, we have water representing chaos that is being brought to order in the creation narratives here. And we have the same thing happening in this story of the flood, where things have returned to chaos, and now there is a separation happening where God is restoring order once again. And in fact, the events that happen after the flood seem to parallel in order the events that happen in the days of creation. And just to give you a little idea about this, I want to show you a little clip from Dr. Tara Vanderweel of the University of Nottingham, as she has a great little synopsis of how these 2 things are so closely paralleled. Take a look.
When you're reading after the post-flood story, right after the rains begin to cease in the Noah story, something very interesting happens, especially in the Hebrew version of the story when you're reading in that language. And that is, it becomes very clear that the storyteller is attempting to match up quite closely the order of events that happen right after the flood begins to stop with the first account of creation in Genesis 1. Okay. So let me walk you through it.
Okay.
Let's just go through Genesis 1 days, just to be clear. Day 1, God's Spirit flutters over the steep, dark chasm of water. Day 2, we have God separates the waters in order to create space within which we live. Day 3, dry land appears. Day 4, there are lights. Day 5, there is a very unusual creation of birds and fish at the same time. And that's because the heavens and underneath the world are both considered watered places. So it makes sense to a Hebrew reader.
There's water above the heavens and water below the heavens.
Yes. And then the final day is when everyone who walks the earth is made, in this day 6. Air breathers and earth walkers. When we get to the story of Noah, we are given this picture, this dire picture of a man and his family and a bunch of earth walkers and air breathers floating in a boat. And the world is covered with water. And what happens first? We have the story of a wind, which is the other word for God's Spirit, blowing across the waters. Day 1. Day 2, the heavens above, the water from the heavens above are shut, and the waters from below are shut.
And in fact, the exact same word, the word we translate as firmament, is used again that has been used in Genesis 1.
Yes. So that firmament is fascinating because really, within the Hebrew cosmology, it's the firmament is actually a firm sheet that has open windows that can open and rain comes in and then they close. So it's actually seen as a hard surface. So the second thing that happens with Noah is suddenly it's said that those things shut, which mimics the second day of the separation of the two and the space for the air between. Day 3, in Genesis 1, dry land appears. This next thing that happens is that mountaintops are seen. So Noah sees mountaintops, dry land. Day 4, we already have heavens and the lights in the sky, so that's unnecessary. But day 5 is perhaps one of the more beautiful things that happens. In Genesis 1, as I said, it was birds and fish are the first creatures that are made. In day 5, or it's not really a day 5, but the fifth event, if you will, that happens to Noah this is when he begins to send the birds out to look for the trees so that they would come back and show him. So we have this image of first the ravens, then the dove flying over the water. Birds and fish are the only thing that exists. And then finally, when he gets that signal, we have the cue, the mimicry of day 6, which is all of the creatures that walk the earth, everything that breathes the air, is released from, commanded to come out from the ark to walk the earth again. So it's very clear that the storyteller is attempting to mimic that creation.
Wow, that is amazing, isn't it? I mean, a fascinating sequence of events after the flood that mirror the order of days in creation, drawing us back to Genesis 1. Now, there is just so many other parallels here we just don't have time to get into, but all of this concludes with the same command that we found in Genesis. You remember, or earlier in Genesis, you remember that there's a command given to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. And this scene with Noah ends with the same command to Noah and his family to be fruitful and multiply. It's echoed from Genesis 1. It is a start over. This is clearly an attempt to speak theologically. It's attempting to mirror a previous text to make a theological point, not just straight journalism. It's been shaped and formed to make a theological point. And so what is that point? Well, this material then here is probably assembled as Israel comes back out of Babylonian, Persian captivity, right? The people of Israel are coming out of exile. They've been destroyed. The land's been taken over. They've been hauled off. They think their God is dead. They're coming back and they need to reestablish who they are. Who is God? Who are we? We need some sort of tie back to who we are as people as we start over. They need some family history. And if they knew the story of Adam and Eve, they need a new story to help them start over. And so they are telling this story as people of God called to be his starting place with humanity. It is a chance for them to re-engage their identity. And so it's clear that they take a very customary ancient story and they stylize it in their own way in order to make some theological points to themselves as a group about who they are and who their God is. Now, the flood then is just another way of telling the same story of Genesis 1 and 2, that the world is off course and God chooses a family to save and have relationship with, and Israel is that family. Which means that this story, as crazy as it is, wasn't really written for curious geologists in 2023 looking for evidence of a worldwide flood. It's written to these confused Israelites who are returning from slavery back to their own land, trying to discover who they are, rediscover who they are and who their God is. And it's going to teach them, again, the choice to live in God's way and how that leads towards something fruitful and beautiful, whereas living in a way of violence and evil leads towards death. And so with all that in mind, we have a story here that isn't likely meant to be read historically or literally. Perhaps the ancient people really did believe that God wiped everybody out in a flood, but I don't believe that. I don't believe that God got to chapter 6 of the Bible, ran out of ideas, and then killed almost all of humanity and almost all the animals. We just have a primitive people here using and stylizing a common story in their world to explain God's identity and their own identity. They're doing theology, not history. So, what do we then do with a story like the flood? Well, I'd suggest our final stop here and a closer look would then suggest something and how we deal with this story as people who follow Jesus. And I think we can get our cues from really approaching the story just the way that the New Testament writers did. Peter actually is going to reference this story in his letter, and he is going to take the story of the flood, which is the most violent act in the Bible, and he is going to redeem it. And we have talked about this already before, that we can take some of these texts in the Old Testament, we don't have to ignore them, we don't have to condemn them necessarily, we can condemn the violence that is there, but we can allow them to speak in a fresh way. And Peter clearly does that in his letter, 1 Peter. He says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And after being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now notice here how Peter is redeeming this text. Peter doesn't use the flood story here when he references it as a story of condemnation or to justify violence against evildoers. In fact, the only person who dies in his retelling of it is Jesus himself. It's God who does the dying, not the people. And Peter says that this isn't really a story of judgment. Now he says it is a story of rescue, okay? Peter points back to it and says, well, God can be seen in this story in how, not how he tries to wipe everyone out, but in how he rescues people from calamity. And notice in the story, in Peter's part here, there's a weird part in verse 20 that says that Jesus even goes back and preaches to those who are imprisoned who were formerly disobedient in the days of Noah. And so we have not just Noah's family being saved here. Peter says, in this bizarre statement that we're not even sure much what to do with, that Christ even extends back and offers rescue to those in Genesis that were killed in the flood. And you think, what? That is bizarre and strange. But it is Peter's way of redeeming the text. You see, the theology of the story that Peter says is to show us that God is a God who will rescue all people. And then he applies it to baptism as a picture of that same type of rescue. He is modeling for us how to take this violent story in the Old Testament and allow it to be redeemed through the story of Jesus. You see, he's saying this is a chance to be reminded of new creation. That God can start fresh with you and will save you from the disaster around you. You see, for Peter, Genesis 6 through 9 is a recreation story. And he says now your participation in the life and the baptism of Jesus is again a recreation, a fresh start. And having gone through the water, you are now something new. God is doing a new thing, moving your life from chaos to order, purpose, and meaning. Peter says, this story wasn't just about the identity of the Israelite people. It's your story too, conformed to the pattern of Jesus. That no matter who you are, through baptism, everyone is invited to be a part of this new creation in Jesus. Not just one family, but all families. This is a new flood theology represented in the baptism of Jesus. It is now a new riff on the old flood story. See, this story isn't just for Noah's family anymore. It's for all people. And what a great message that is. That God has come for all people. The resurrection of Jesus is the true recreation in life. It's a violent story. But Peter says, we shouldn't look to this story looking for a God who is trying to commit violence. We should look in the story and notice God is the one who rescues. Given the fact that this story is probably not literal or historic anyway, I think that is a very good Jesus way to read this story and embrace the way of Jesus. So today, we want to go to the table. We want to go take communion. We want to remember that Jesus has come to save us, to rescue us. We're going to do that by going to communion now. Billy's going to lead us in a song, and you could take communion during that time, and then we'll come back, and I'll wrap up with some announcements. But let me pray for us first. God, we want to thank you today that you are a God who rescues. God, I don't believe for a minute, because of what we know about you and Jesus, you being the true revelation of what God is like, we don't believe that, God, you 6 chapters into the Bible gave up on humanity and threw it all away and then got some better ideas later. We believe that you have loved us from the beginning. No matter what misconceptions people have had about you, you've met people right where they are. You've continued to love them. And now you have revealed yourself through the person Jesus so that we know exactly what you are like. God, we pray that you would help us to see you as the one who rescues. God, thank you for this strange, bizarre story that points us toward the reminder of your love, that you want to rescue all of us. Help us to love the people that you love, which is every human on this planet. God, help us to be a part of your great rescue. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, let's go to communion together, and then we got a few announcements here at the end.
Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. Wait upon the Lord, we will wait upon the Lord. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Our God, you reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't grow weary. You're the defender of me. You comfort those in need. You lift us up on wings like eagles. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Our God, you reign forever. Our hope, our strong deliverer. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't grow weary. You're the defender of me. You comfort those in need. You lift us up on wings like eagles. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God, the everlasting God, the everlasting. You are the everlasting God, the everlasting God. You do not faint, you won't grow weary. You're the defender of me. You comfort those in need. You lift us up on wings like eagles. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. Strength arises, we wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord. We will wait upon the Lord.
All right, that's great. Couple announcements here as we wrap up today. I know, sorry if I just upset you with the fact that the Noah flood story may not be historically accurate and real. But hopefully it gives you a way to think through the story and read the story in a way that draws you closer to God. I hope that that's helpful that way. A couple of things here as we wrap up today. Some announcements, some things that are going on this summer. First of all, if you would like to give or donate, we appreciate that. You can go to our website at findpathways.com/donate, and you can set up a one-time gift or a recurring gift. And I'd encourage you to do it right now today. Help us out here. We're trying to put out some stuff that's a little different than a lot of things that people are teaching in churches. I know there's a lot of people that have wanted to walk away from faith altogether because of things like the flood story. And there just aren't a ton of places, it feels like, that are giving people better options for thinking about the text. And so if you want to support that work, man, we could really use your help, and you can partner with us by giving financially, especially here online. I know there's not a lot of other connection when you're online in terms of being with other people, but one of the ways you can really support us is by donating. And if you'd like to do that, we'd love that today. A couple other things. This next Sunday in our in-person gathering on June 4th, we're going to be doing Graduation Sunday. We have several graduates leaving high school, and we want to honor them. So we're going to be celebrating them next week. Quite an accomplishment, graduating high school. It's a big step in a young person's life, and so we're going to be celebrating them next week. As we go along this summer here, a couple other big rocks that'll be in the summer calendar. We are going to have a summer break on July 2nd. That's obviously the Sunday right before July 4th. So we won't be meeting in person or online on that Sunday. Just wanted to make you aware of that. Then coming up August 6th, we're going to an Everett Aqua Sox game. It's Julio Rodriguez bobblehead night. So the first, I don't know how many ever fans get there, get a Julio Rodriguez bobblehead, and we're going to sit together. We did this last year. It was a lot of fun. And so if you want to join us in that, we'll have a way in the next couple weeks here to buy tickets and to join us. Also, if you want to get our email newsletter, you can do that by messaging us on Facebook and dropping your name and email there and saying, please add me to the list. Or you can email me. My email is on the screen here. You can send me a little note saying add me to the newsletter, and we would be happy to do that. Okay, that's pretty much it for this week. We got one more sermon here on nonviolence. Next week, we're going to just talk about what about us? How do we engage in nonviolence? How do we pattern our ways out of the ways of Jesus? And how does that look in a modern world? So we'll finish up with that next week. And then this summer, we're going to do a series on the book of Psalms, which has some really, really fascinating structure to it that we're going to learn about. And then in the fall, we're going to do a series on same-sex relationships, and it'll be one of the Construction Zone series, and we'll rethink some ideas there. So that's where we're going here over the next few months and weeks. Hopefully this is a really good week for you. It's supposed to be nice again in the Pacific Northwest area, so enjoy it while it's here, because we know it doesn't last forever. It'll be raining 40 days and 40 nights again pretty soon, so enjoy it while you can. Okay, hope you have a really great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.